right, so just as we let some folks trickle in, I just wanted to, we're going to start off with a poll. I just wanted to gauge kind of how familiar people already are with the vacancy tax, now designated Measure N. So folks can go ahead and fill that out. Just also wanting to know where folks are getting their information. The main reason we're doing this is we just want to be sure people have the information they need to make informed decisions in November. So want to see where folks are getting their information. If folks can fill that out, we would appreciate it. All right. Perfect. And thanks everyone for bearing with us. This is our first time ever producing a webinar. So thanks for bearing with us as we navigate Zoom and work through this, but I think we can go ahead and kick off introductions. So we are Locals for Affordable Housing, two of its co-founders. My name is Amelia Richmond. I've been in Lake Tahoe for 15 years. The first part of that was on the North Shore. I was there while the housing crisis got increasingly dire on the North Shore. Started working down here in 2016, volunteering down here in 2019, and had the honor of moving down full-time in 2021. And it's been really amazing to get increasingly involved in this community and meet so many amazing people. As Locals for Affordable Housing, we are a group of 85 volunteers that work to gather more than 2,400 signatures to work to get the vacancy tax on the November ballot. So that's why we're here today, trying to make sure we give everyone the information they need. Nick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Speal, and I'm also a South Lake Tahoe resident. I've been renting in the Sierra Tract for the past 4 years and lived in a number of different places around the South Shore region for the past 8. And, throughout that time, I've really felt the housing affordability challenge get worse. And so, excited to be a part of Locals for Affordable Housing, to be making a difference in that. In other parts of my life, I'm also the president of the Lake Tahoe Bicycle Coalition. I'm on the board of the Tahoe Transportation District, and I previously served on the Planning Commission. But all of those are sort of another part of my life here in Tahoe. It looks like a lot of people have arrived and filled out the poll, so we can maybe take a look at some of those poll results. Let's share those results as I figure out Zoom here. So it looks like a number of people here are already very familiar or somewhat familiar with the Tahoe vacancy tax, now Measure N. So that's good to hear. And so hopefully you'll be still learning something new tonight. It seems like people are learning from a number of different sources around the community and online, and hope that tonight that we'll be able to give you a just really a comprehensive overview of the policy, so that way everybody can be making informed decisions in November. I also just wanted to mention that we have one of our other volunteers, Francesca, joining us tonight, who will be manning the chat. And so she'll be answering questions and answers. And so the way that we're going to be doing it is as we're kind of going through information, we've got a slide deck here. If you have any follow-up questions, anything you want to ask, she'll do her best to answer those live. We'll also have a Q&A session towards the end. And if we don't get to all of your questions, we want to be able to email you with any responses. And so if you're not logged into Zoom yet, make sure you click that sign in button in the top right to sign in so we can follow up with emails, or just include your email in your question. And anything else before we get started on the agenda?
No, I think let's go ahead and dive in. We'll be working next week to get back to as many folks as we can for questions we can't answer today. So thanks for your patience there. I think just walking through the agenda real quick. So it looks like a lot of folks are already really familiar with the policy, which is awesome. But thanks for bearing with us as we explain some of the background information for folks who might be less aware. So we're going to address the housing crisis as a whole, the rising vacancy rates, how vacancy taxes work, the funding gap in our community, and then understanding Measure N, as well as try to take some questions. A lot of folks did write in with questions in advance. We've got a couple of those prepared, and then we're going to try to take some live as well. Cool. Okay, so the housing crisis. So I think a lot of folks are already really familiar and intimately acquainted with the housing crisis, but there has been some talk on social media recently questioning if there is a housing crisis in Tahoe. So we wanted to include some data for those who are not intimately aware. So for high-level data, median home prices have more than doubled since 2013. That's according to the Realtors Association's own data. They put out a market report last fall. Median rents have increased by 44% in the same time frame. And the TRPA noted in their 2022 Tackling the Tahoe Housing Crisis letter that half of the Lake Tahoe workers in Lake Tahoe now live outside the region. And of those who do live here, nearly 2/3 do not earn enough to afford the typical expenses or living expenses of a typical family. So next slide. We have seen a 10% population decline according to census data since 2000, but it's worth noting that 24%, we've seen a 24% decline in working age population. So that's a loss of approximately 4,000 working age adults, age 19 to 49. And a 35% population loss of our youth population, a loss of roughly 2,500 school-age children, age 5 to 19. And for context, in California as a whole, the working age adult population has actually increased by 7%, and the youth has only declined by 2%. So just to put in contrast, we are seeing quite a larger dip than other parts of the state. The way that has affected our schools is one of the most critical aspects. So one thing that it seems to not be known by everyone is that the vast majority of school funding in California comes from enrollment, and specifically it's attendance-based funding. So as our enrollment declines, we see a major dip in our school budgets, and we've seen that actually reflected on recent ballot as we've had to vote in for new taxes to make up the difference. So there's been a 36% decline at LTUSD in enrollment since 2000. And we actually now have, unfortunately, 136 school children in our district experiencing homelessness, and that is up significantly from last year. So you can see those stats there, pretty tough number to see. The housing crisis has also had a major impact on businesses. So there was a survey done of South Shore employers in 2019, and when polled, 89% of South Lake employers said that affordable housing is either the single most critical problem or among the most critical problems that their business is facing. And when they were asked if anyone refused a job offer or left their employment in the past month, 49% of employers said they had someone decline a job offer or leave their employment because they could not find or afford suitable housing. And 19% said that they had something like that happen because employees couldn't find adequate transportation. So these are major issues affecting our business community.
And so in response to a lot of this business need, the Tahoe Prosperity Center studied what is the overall housing need in the South Shore region. And some quotes that came from their employer survey include: the biggest challenge with recruiting for South Lake Tahoe is the cost of living, available housing, and the pool of qualified candidates. Another business owner said, I have had candidates scheduled for interviews, and then after they look for housing in the basin, they cancel. We have lost several potential employees to this issue. And so when adding up all the numbers, they estimated that by 2026, we'll be short 3,290 housing units on the South Shore.
And so one thing that isn't talked about as much is the increasing vacancy rate and how that's really contributed to the housing crisis. So in 2000, per census data, the vacancy rate in South Lake Tahoe was 33%. It's increased to 44% in 2022, which is the latest year we have census data for. And what's even a bigger deal is that the increase in vacant homes is actually outpacing the housing that we're building as a community. So we built over 2,200 new homes collectively in South Lake since 2000, but vacant homes increased by 2,500. And so we actually ended up with a net loss of 300 occupied housing units. And so the question is, we do need to continue to build more housing, but what's going to stop more housing from becoming more vacant second homes? And how do we shift that trajectory? So on the North Shore, Tahoe City's vacancy rate has now risen to 70%. And folks up there are really struggling. People are regularly kicked out of their rentals as their landlords sell. Businesses are struggling to find and keep good staff. It's really impacting their schools. I was up there for a couple years ago for a friend's memorial, and I had two friends in separate dual income households at the bar really stressed out because they felt like they were going to have to pull their kids out of school. Their landlords were selling their rentals and they could not find available housing. What we want to do is make sure that we don't follow in that trajectory down here. So this is such an amazing, vibrant community in South Lake. We want to be sure it stays that way and that we don't follow this trajectory of vacant mountain towns across the Mountain West. So what is a vacancy tax? A vacancy tax is an annual fee on housing that sits empty for the majority of the year. So the elegance of a vacancy tax is that it shifts the incentive to use more of the existing inventory while simultaneously generating a new funding source that can be used to build more housing and also help fill other funding gaps in the community. The increased supply, both from using more of the existing supply and also building more housing, is then able to increase the supply, and that stabilizes costs, typically what other markets have seen that has passed vacancy taxes. And also a big part of this is it discourages the future conversion to more second homes moving forward. So at some point, it is likely that interest rates will drop back, maybe not back to 2020 levels, but they will. And the question is, when those houses start to move, who's going to buy them? Are we going to see more locals outbid by second homeowners, look to keep those homes empty for a part of the year or most of the year? So what we really want to do is see how we can shift the trajectory moving forward towards more full-time occupancy, knowing that that's going to be more people here supporting businesses on a regular basis, enrolling their kids in school, and just participating full-time in the economy.
And so here in South Lake Tahoe, we're not the first to be considering a vacancy tax by any stretch. Around the United States, here in California, there are a number of other cities, including Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, that have all implemented vacancy taxes. Newport, Rhode Island, Frederick, Maryland. Washington, D.C. has actually had their vacancy tax since 2010. Several counties in Hawaii have vacancy taxes. All of Utah has actually had a vacancy tax since the 80s. And so that's just the United States. In Canada, over a dozen cities have a vacancy tax in addition to a federal vacancy tax nationwide. Around the world, there are vacancy taxes in Japan, Austria, Australia, India, all of the country of Ireland, all of France. So we're really not the first.
Yeah, and in addition to having vacancy taxes having been passed in other countries and cities around the world, they've also been studied here in Tahoe for the last 5 years. So what we have here, and when we share this, people will be actually able to click on these links, is vacancy taxes have been mentioned and discussed in reports done by all sorts of different organizations in our area, trying to figure out funding to solve local problems. So what you'll see here is that it's been mentioned in some city strategic plans for years. It's also part of the South Shore Regional Housing Action Plan. The TTD, the Tahoe Transportation District, also mentioned vacancy taxes when considering funding sources. So these are not a new idea. What's important to note is that as people keep mentioning these in reports, what stops them from being moved forward isn't the policy itself, but the lack of political will.
And so why are all these different local agencies considering a vacancy tax? Because there's a big gap in the funding needed for the programs to keep South Lake Tahoe a vibrant community. The city, published its housing element a few years ago with with a roadmap for how to solve the housing crisis. And this was celebrated across the state, actually earning the city a pro-housing designation. But those programs need to be funded. And so there are 45 programs on the housing element, ranging from completing the Sugar Pine Village project, which is great, but not fully funded yet, to building the next version of that, closer to Heavenly Village, to missing middle programs that aren't eligible for grant funding that goes to things like Sugar Pine Village. So things like the Lease to Locals program, which incentivizes second homeowners to rent to locals and gives them a bonus if they do that. That's not eligible for grant funding, but if we wanted to expand that, we could do that with a local funding source. Same goes for a whole bunch of other things in the housing element, including first-time homebuyer programs that we used to have and that would be really great to bring back. Other things that really desperately need funding are the roads. We've all driven on the roads and felt those bumps. And at the current rate, it will take over 100 years to fix all the roads. And that's sort of assuming that they don't even get worse in the meantime. And so we really do need a meaningful funding source to be able to pick up the pace there. We also need to expand transit and bike paths to reduce traffic, and all of these things take funding. And all of these things take funding, and it's important to do that without adding more taxes on local businesses and local residents. Others in the community are proposing different ways of addressing this funding gap. For example, increasing the TOT hotel tax higher than it currently is, or introducing a new business improvement district to tax the businesses on the South Shore, or introducing a real estate transfer tax to add a sales tax on top of the already high cost of housing. So I think that there's a lot of consensus around the community that a funding source is needed, but I think that it's especially important that a vacancy tax is used because it doesn't increase taxes on local residents and businesses.
Yeah, so in terms of how understanding Measure N, so Measure N of the vacancy tax is a special tax. So it can only be spent on housing, roads, transit, and implementation. And that's really important to know. I know there's been some confusion on whether or not it is a general tax. It is not. It is a special tax. The funding can only be spent on these things.
And so the city actually recently published a report with an impartial analysis of the fiscal impacts of the tax. And they did an estimate of how they could implement the tax. And of course, there's staff required for doing that. All of this costs money. But they actually estimated that this will cost less than 3% of the $20 million that they estimate will bring in every single year. Even those first initial startup costs are less than 0.5% of the city's budget. And then can be paid back by that annual $20 million in dedicated funding that comes through every year after that.
All right, and so here we have a pie chart, and these are based on the city's impartial analysis on their numbers of what they projected this policy would do. So they're estimating that the tax revenue from those who elect to keep their properties empty would generate $20 million per year for housing, roads, and transit. Some of them would be ineligible or exempt. So we're accounting for that. It's a conservative number. And then the additional piece of that is for those who are not looking to pay the tax and might shift how they're using it. So maybe it's folks just using their own properties more often. We'd love to have more people here participating in the economy on a local basis. People can just, hopefully spend more time here in the community. I know it's a big part of people's hearts. What the city is estimating the policy would do is actually recover 1,543 households. And I use the word recover because we talked about that population loss since 2000. So this is actually bringing back that lost population so that they can be here on a regular basis.
And the big thing when you bring back lost population is those local residents spend money in the local economy. And so in addition to the revenue that the vacancy tax brings in for dedicated to housing, roads, and transit, those local residents are estimated to spend $27 million in the local economy. And the city estimated this based on an average $18,000 in spending per household, which is consistent with averages across the nation, and really roughly corresponds to about $500 per month for locals to be spending in the local economy.
Awesome. And then in addition to just the increase in revenue for local businesses, there's also sales tax generated from that goes back into the city budget. So not even looking at the revenue from the actual vacancy tax, but just the revenue from the added sales tax on business transactions. The city is estimating, and that would boost the general fund by $600,000 per year. And those funds can be used for fire prevention, public safety, parks and rec, and other essential services for a vibrant community. And that doesn't even include any reflection of the numbers of business growth from having more housing to attract and hire more full-time employees, which we talked about earlier in the report, how that's been hindering business growth.
Cool. So now we're going to go through the measure text of Measure N, all of which, by the way, is online and available at TahoeVacancyTax.com and has been since January when we started circulating the petition. And I definitely recommend taking a look at that, especially the first page, which includes the summary written by the city attorney, which just kind of summarizes everything on one page.
So one question that we get a lot is, how is occupancy defined? So occupancy is defined as someone in the home 183 days or more. That can be occupied by an owner, a renter, a house guest, some combination thereof. The idea is just to have people here participating in our economy and our community on a regular basis. Which is good for everyone. It also means more people enrolling their kids in school here, which we know will boost enrollment and that attendance-based funding. It's also important to know that the occupancy does not need to be consecutive. So it can be occupied for a chunk of the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, part of the end of the year. It does not need to be 183 days in a row by any means. It also does not need to be the whole house. So folks could rent out one room to one person, maybe someone who could keep an eye on things in the winter, make sure pipes don't freeze. There's no requirement that it be the entire home. Another question we get a lot is about short-term leases. So even with Measure T in place, leases can still be done that are 30 days or more. So if someone really loves using their home for a couple months of the summer, or on and off, they could put a renter in for 30, 60, 90 days in the winter to make up that difference and hit that mark. So there's also, we know we get a lot of questions about homes being furnished. There are great websites out there like Furnished Finder that can help find vetted renters for furnished units. So especially folks like travel nurses might come in, or just our seasonal workforce, who would probably be relieved to not have to furnish their own home. You can find them on websites like that and make it streamlined. It's also worth noting that moving folks into seasonal rentals like that frees up other units that can then be used for year-round members of our workforce. So it really does benefit everyone to increase our housing supply like that. And we also wanted to provide some context for what 183 days. So local residents who live in their homes will not pay this tax. So if you wanted to travel for 12 weeks on vacation over the course of the year, yay for you, great PTO, hopefully, that's going to total 281 days still remaining in your home after all that vacation. So well within the threshold. For someone that might want to spend December through April in Arizona, avoid the snow, tired of shoveling, we get it. That's still going to mean they're in their home for 214 days. So again, well over that threshold. We know some people do have to travel for work, maybe commuting outside the area. So if someone spends 3 days of every week on the road for work, they're still in that home 208 days over the year. Again, well over that threshold. So just some perspective for folks who may be wondering what this means with their travel schedules.
The one thing that was just really important to us, that is local residents who live in their homes will not pay any tax at all. And another aspect of that is exemptions. Amelia, would you like to explain that one?
Yeah, for sure. So exemptions we felt really important. There's members of our community who may need to leave their homes for jobs, especially really essential jobs that we need. Important that that we wanted to be sure we're exempt in the policy. So wildland firefighters, we know they work crazy schedules. We know wildfire season is expanding, and that their work may take them away from their homes more than 183 days for a year. So they're exempt. Active duty military, also exempt. Other emergency service workers that may need to travel. Similar, we know that folks may need to be out of their homes or even outside of the area if they're seeking medical treatment or in care facilities. So there's an exemption for that. Also exempt are non-winterized cabins. So these are homes that may lack suitable insulation. Their pipes can't be used, safely in winter months. Those are exempt. Also properties that are under renovation or under construction or have been impacted by disasters or emergencies. Ownership transfers, these are all exempt. There's a whole list in the full measure text. It's also worth noting that more can be added. So there is a process. We as a community feel like there were things missed. Other folks who should be exempt, other properties that should be exempt. There is a process for how those can be added, after the passing of this measure.
Great. So let's dive in to understand the price structure of Measure N. So it's pretty simple. It's $3,000 for the first year that the tax is vacant, and $6,000 for each consecutive year that it remains vacant after that. And those rates do go up with inflation, so it will always be $3,000 and $6,000 in today's dollars. Due to Proposition 13 in California, it's actually not possible to structure the tax as a percentage of the home value. But we've got a chart here that shows how these values would be computed as a percentage of, for example, a $1 million second home. So those $3,000 to $6,000 in South Lake Tahoe, which is the same as Berkeley, adds up to about 0.3 to 0.6% of a $1 million property. If you compare that to other places like Vancouver or Washington, D.C., outside of California, where they do have a percentage-based tax, that's $35,000 to $100,000 annually that people are paying in the vacancy tax in these regions. And so it is significantly lower in that sense. Also, maybe just thinking about this on a monthly basis, second homeowners who have an extra house in Tahoe will be paying $500 per month for the vacancy tax. And that's less than my rent has gone up in the past 4 years, just to put that in context.
Cool. So rollout and enforcement, I know there's a lot of questions around this. One scare tactic that we've heard trotted out around town is folks saying you need to prove you live here, and that's not true. What will be required is a quick, easy annual self-reported form that can be completed online, by mail, or in person. If declared occupied or exempt, there's no tax owed. And there is, it's like other tax documents, you're signing under perjury that what you're saying is honest and true. If the city finds that someone is caught lying, there are large penalties for that and expanded penalties for repeat offenders. And in the city's impartial analysis, the city found 10 methods to identify fraud. The slides are included here, but you can find these on city report pages 19 and 20.
So this has really been done before in a lot of other cities, and Vancouver is one with quite detailed data. And they publish an annual report every year since 2017. And in that time frame, they've seen a 54% decrease in vacant properties, while at the same time, they've been able to raise $142 million directly allocated towards affordable housing initiatives in Vancouver. After that success, 14 other municipalities within that province adopted vacancy taxes as well.
Cool. And Nick, I think we might have lost the presentation on Zoom, and I know there's a chart on the next slide if we want to get that back up.
Thank you. Yes, let me try to troubleshoot that. Yikes.
Thanks, guys. Bear with us. Okay, we're hearing some folks are seeing the slides fine, so it may just be our view. Anyway,
Okay, let me try and pull that up
yeah,
again.
we'll continue. Oh, never mind. Okay. Looks
Well,
like
I stopped sharing for a moment and should be shared again now.
great. I can see it.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
So I can speak to this. So we were just talking about Vancouver, a little bit closer to home here in Berkeley. Their vacancy tax went into effect this year. And immediately leading up to that, they saw a 7% reduction in median rents as more supply came onto the market and landlords are incentivized to fill those units.
Cool. There's also been some academic research done on vacancy taxes. So specifically, the Journal of Public Economics did a study on France's vacancy tax. It's worth adding that France has. Oh, Nick, I think we lost it again. But I'll keep talking, I think, while he pulls that back up. So the Journal of Public Economics found that sorry, and what I meant to say is France actually already had a tax on second homes and then added an additional vacancy tax on empty units. But what they found was that France's vacancy tax accounted for a 13% decrease in vacancy rates between 1997 and 2001. And another really interesting finding from their analysis was that the vacancy tax was a lot more effective than positive incentives or just the incentives of rental revenue itself. So we have programs here that are great, like landing locals, that have been working to positively incentivize rentals. They have not converted at the rates anyone was hoping. And that was really consistent with France's findings. They found that the vacancy tax was more impactful than positive incentives. And one of the great things that we can do here is both. So landing locals is a great program. It is about to run out of some funding. So the vacancy tax can fund positive incentives. And so those who want to find a renter to put in their home and avoid the vacancy tax can also benefit from those positive incentives from programs like landing locals. So yeah, interesting finding. There's the vacancy taxes across the board are increasing in popularity. More folks are looking to them as tools as more and more municipalities realize and wrestle with the high cost that increasing vacant homes are having on their communities. So great to see this research, and we're excited to see more as it comes out, as more people pass these and study them.
Great. So that roughly wraps up our overview of Measure N. And we're going to shift gears first to a number of the questions that we got with your Zoom RSVPs. And so thank you for submitting some of those questions in advance. We'll explain some of those in detail. And then I am seeing some questions in the chat. And so after these, we will get to some of those as time allows. So a common question that we touched on a little bit, but I'm also still seeing in the chat here is why not make the tax a percentage of the property value? In California here, we have Proposition 13 passed in 1978 that prohibits new taxes that are a percentage of the property value. There is one exception given by Prop 39 for school bonds, but generally new taxes as a property value aren't allowed. And so this is why you see it implemented like that in a number of other places outside of California, but all of the different cities in California that are doing this have a set amount, and that's basically one of the constraints from Prop 13. It's also one of the reasons why Measure N is written as an excise tax, not a property tax. And so it's really not a tax on your property as much as on a tax on the act of keeping it vacant and not using it. By the way, another sort of outcome of Prop 13 is taxes are effectively based on the sale value of the home. And so if your house has been inherited for multiple generations or was bought a long time ago, a lot of people are paying taxes now, where if you pay that small property tax plus the vacancy tax, it's still going to be a less total tax than new residents in South Lake Tahoe are paying for just their property taxes at current rates.
Well, great. And then another question we get a lot, and I saw at least one person mention this in the Q&A, so we will answer this live, which is that does this need 50% plus one, a simple majority, or does this need 2/3 vote to pass? And totally understandable. There's a lot of confusion on that point. The answer is that it is a special tax and it only does need a simple majority, a 50% plus one to pass. And the reason for that is that this is a citizen-led ballot initiative. So if people can still see the slides, there is a screenshot from Ballotpedia explaining this, but if not, I'll walk through it. So if City Council were to propose the same measure text, a special tax that could only be spent on housing, roads, and transit, they would need 2/3 vote to pass that. However, because this is a citizens ballot initiative put forth by voters, not the legislature, we can pass it under California law with a simple majority of 50% plus one. So I know there's been a lot of confusion out there. It's a pretty nuanced piece of the policy, but we only need a simple majority to pass in November.
Wonderful, thank you. So that's some of the prepared questions that we had ready to answer. And so now we'll take a minute to take a look through some of the Q&A that have come in live. If you have any more, please feel welcome to submit those now. Maybe, especially now that you know what we've covered, if we've missed anything or if you'd like any sort of further clarification. Some questions we might not be able to get to right now, but do make sure that you are either signed in to Zoom and we'll be able to follow up with harder questions. Amelia, did you have any that you'd like to take?
Yeah, I'm looking through them right now. Thank you guys for your patience. Let's see.
I see one here from Tom. It says, doesn't the city or the federal government take care of the roads? Broadly in America, totally. Most roads are big highways. For example, Highway 50 through South Lake Tahoe is a Caltrans maintained state route, and so the state is responsible for Highway 50, and the city's actually not even allowed. Even if they wanted to volunteer to fill the potholes, the city has no role in that. Whereas the flip side is all of the local streets. So there's something like 200 miles of local streets within the city of South Lake Tahoe. Those are the local jurisdiction's responsibility, and the state and federal governments do not have interest in funding those.
See. Great. And then Linda asked a question about what makes the determination for an exemption. So I'm actually trying to pull up the measure text so I make sure I get the nuances of this correct. Nick, unless you have it up, but I know we've definitely gotten an answer to this.
Sorry, I missed that?
Oh, yeah. Linda asked a question of who makes determination for an exemption.
Okay.
Oh, and I guess I should have clarified. I was wondering, is that a question? I guess we could answer it two ways, which is who makes the determination for new exemptions, which would be the process outlined in the measure text, or who reviews it. City staff would be the ones reviewing whether or not somebody qualifies for those exemptions. And then Linda, we'll follow up with you with the details after in terms of if the question was intended to mean what's the actual process for adding exemptions. It's definitely outlined in the measure text. I just want to be sure I don't misspeak to it, but we'll follow up with you on that.
And each of these exemptions really is, treated a little bit differently. For example, construction is an exemption while the building is under active construction, so you do need to have a building permit, right? And so we want to avoid loopholes where you're repairing a window for too long, and so there's language there where the city manager is allowed to determine what is a reasonable time for a given exemption. There's other things that are laid out in the full measure text, which again is available at TahoeVacancyTax.com. For example, after a disaster, let's say, tragically, a natural disaster affects your home, it then does not need to be occupied for another 3 years. And so a lot of those details are outlined in the measure text, but also the implementation, the way it works with this sort of thing is the implementation ends up being decided by the city staff.
Yeah. Awesome. So Jay Crouch asked, you define vacant as 183 days a year. Where did you come up with that? Are the other cities that have imposed a vacancy tax also using 183 days as the standard? So the answer is it's in line with census data. So when we report that 44% of all housing units in the city are vacant, that's based on census data, and the census actually defines vacant as 183 days or more. A lot of the other vacancy taxes that have been passed were modeled on that as well. It varies a little bit city to city and country to country, but it is the metric used in Berkeley, which we used as a basis for ours. And it's one of the more common ways of doing it. Let's see.
I think maybe
yeah,
one thing that I can just elaborate on that to piggyback there is a number of other cities, within the region have already implemented or are considering vacancy taxes, and 183 days is conveniently half the year because you can't spend the majority of the year in multiple places. And so let's say you own a home both in Berkeley and in South Lake Tahoe. It's not possible to both live in South Lake Tahoe for the majority of the year or in Berkeley for the majority of the year. And so you'll end up having to choose, okay, which place am I going to spend the majority of my time, my money, and then pay an economic offset in the other city.
Totally. Andy asked, is there a media strategy to spread personal stories of the potential upsides of the measure? Yes. So we'd love to collect more stories from folks about their stories with housing, their stories just in living in this community as things have gotten harder. Really, any reason that folks support the policy, we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out. Our information will be at the end of this deck. We'd love to hear from you, and we will be collecting those stories and working on telling them in more narrative fashions to make sure that the narrative in the community is balanced. Also, Matt is asking, how is affordable housing if someone rents or sells their house at fair market value? So there's a couple different components about affordable housing. One is that basically with a large local funding source, we can build housing and also do public-private partnerships to get more housing that can house our missing middle. So Nick spoke earlier a bit about Sugar Pines and some of the low-income housing projects that the city's done a great job building. They've done a great job leveraging some city money for state and federal grant funds to build those projects. The challenge is that because of the stipulations on those grants, they cannot be used to fund housing for folks over a certain income level. So our teachers, our firefighters, our nurses, really important members of our community without whom we do not function, make too much to qualify for places like Sugar Pine. So we need to figure out how to house the missing middle. And what we can do with a local funding source is find ways to build more deed restricted properties, to incentivize developers to build the housing that we need, to bring back programs like the First Time Home Buyers Assistance Program that we used to have but lost, and fund other key elements of the city's existing housing element in order to create more affordable housing for our community. So there's capital A affordable housing that this can fund, but really the missing funding gap is to fund housing for the missing middle, and that's what we're looking to do. Also, the incentive shifts alone create housing. I think that's a really important point. So, when the city is estimating that it's going to help us recover 1,500 households, that's 1,500 households we don't have to build new housing for. So a lot of this really is about using the housing that we already have so that we can be a vibrant community.
I'm seeing a question from Kathleen about the exemptions again. And I'm actually, I don't think we actually spoke about this one when I talked through the exemptions, but about ownership transfers. And so what happens if the home is up for sale and unoccupied? you can't just list the house for sale and be exempt. You could imagine that that might be a loophole. People might list their house for sale for $10 million and then be able to leave it exempt forever. But what does happen is any portion of the year that you don't live in the house counts as if it's occupied. And so, or sorry, that you don't own the house counts as if it's occupied. And so let's say you sell your house in July, then the months of August, September through December, all of those count as if it's occupied. And so it's totally expected that there will be some time in leading up to a sale that the house will be unoccupied. But all of those remaining months really add up towards not having to pay the vacancy tax in that year. Shelley's asking about where did the $6,000 value come from, and that really came from Berkeley's measure that a lot of this was based off of. There's a lot of legal precedent in Berkeley's. Yeah, that measure is held up strongly, and so there's a lot of this that is based on that. I'm seeing another question about the economic growth that comes from more occupancy. Let me pull up the slide there that corresponded to that one. What was that? The economic impact. And so the city did estimate that the new households, the recovered households of people who'd be able to live here again, of over 1,500 of them, would spend $27 million. And the question is asking about what about the spending from the previous person who owned that, or owned the house and didn't use it. And I think that what we would see, we're expecting, and to pull up this slide again, a lot of the people who are using their house on an occasional basis will continue to do so and will pay the vacancy tax. But there are some houses, I can think of 3 or 4 just on my block, that are pretty much never used at all. I think it's been over a year since I've seen my neighbors next door. And a lot of those houses are what we'd expect to be the first ones to be converting into local housing. And so we expect the strongest economic boost that comes from really these especially underutilized houses becoming full-time, becoming occupied full-time.
So Bob is asking if all the vacancy tax we mentioned are in action now or if some are hold during litigation. So can't speak to the international ones, which we're still researching more about, but here in the US, all of the vacancy taxes are in action now. So there is litigation in San Francisco, but it's important to know, I think, a couple things on this front. Yes, vacancy taxes are legal. Washington, D.C., a city certainly with no shortage of lawyers familiar with the Constitution, has had a vacancy tax since 2010. So it's over 14 years without any legal challenges to the tax. Measure N was modeled primarily after Berkeley's vacancy tax, not San Francisco's. There are no legal challenges against Berkeley or Oakland's vacancy tax this time. And there's a number of really important differences between the two measures, many of which render the litigants' claims for the San Francisco's vacancy tax irrelevant for Measure N here in Tahoe. But speaking to San Francisco's, I know a lot of people have questions about this. So the city of San Francisco's team, and this is actually outlined in the city's report, has making a really effective legal case that their excise tax is neither a takings, either a violation of a takings claim or a violation of the Ellis Act, as the measure seeks to encourage owners to occupy, inhabit, or use, their language, their residential units for more than 182 days per year, and does not require owners to rent their units. And they cited that similar local ordinances have been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. So yeah, I think that even, and the other piece about San Francisco is it's still moving forward while in litigation. So to answer Bob's question, no, none of them are on hold.
Cool. Seeing another question here. from Shelley, and it's talking about what types of housing the city is allowed to be building, suggesting maybe the city might be interested in building luxury housing rather than affordable housing. So again, this is a special tax, and so the money can only be spent on certain purposes, but those purposes are fairly broad to give the city council some discretion on what types of housing are needed in a given year. So first of all, when we see a lot of luxury housing being built, that's generally built by the private market. The city has never been building themselves any luxury housing. And so I think that really speaks to the value of having a funding source for the city to be able to build the types of housing that are important to the voters of the city. There is, if you read the measure text, it was a little bit detailed for us to include in this slide deck, but there are constraints on what types of housing. So for example, there must be either an income limit or a local residency requirement or a wealth requirement. There are a handful of different requirements like that associated with each of the housing units that get built under this revenue source. And so that enables the city to be able to use this money with some discretion for what is needed, but only for affordable housing.
See, there's a question here about if litigation could cost the city millions. And the answer is no. The city actually included this in their impartial analysis. Estimated legal challenges were around estimated $100,000. It's a small percentage of the revenue that the policy could bring in. In addition to that, I think there's been a lot of folks talking about how the cost for any litigation can be covered by the measure. And so they can be paid back if those need to be covered in advance by Measure N. And then I think it's really important. I don't fully understand the pushback, which is the measure is designed to be fully self-sufficient. So that means covering cost for administration, covering cost for any litigation. I think that's usually the sign of a good policy, that you don't need to be pulling funding in from other sources. But we'll continue to take questions about that. I think that was the one I saw here.
Seeing another question here, when will the tax go into effect? So I can walk through maybe the broader timeline there. So again, it's on the ballot November 5th, 2024, this year. Once it passes in November, the city will have about 1 year, just over 1 year, to implement the policy. And so that's the year 2025. And then starting on January 1st, 2026 is when the tax will be in effect. And so if you occupy your house for the majority of 2026, then you pay no taxes at all. But if you do not occupy your house for 2026, then in 2027, you will owe the first $3,000 of the vacancy tax.
Cool. Okay. I know we want to be sure that we wrap on time and be respectful of folks' evenings. So we'll maybe take one more question. Scrolling through, I know there's a lot of questions we're not able to get through, so we will be following up with folks. So just get us some time so that we can get people information that they need. I think this one was just answered. Okay, I think we want to maybe just address this. It looks like a lot of folks are writing in with this about who can vote on this measure. So the folks who can vote are people who have a domicile in the city of South Lake Tahoe, and it's pretty clear. If I know that the Registrar of Voters has been reaching out to some folks to clarify this, as there has been some confusion and a lot of misinformation on the internet. In terms of discussion around taxation without representation, is owning multiple properties does not get you multiple votes. That's not how democracy works. Democracy is one person, one vote. What we would love is for more people to come and join the community on a full-time basis. And then if you're here and this is your domicile and it is your primary residence, then absolutely you can vote on this policy, as well as everything else going on in the community. So I know a couple folks wrote in with that question.
Wonderful. So we do want to get you out of here on time. So thank you so much for your attention, all of your questions throughout the past hour. Amelia, do you want to take the rest of this?
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. All right, yeah, so 7 o'clock. Thank you guys so much. We'll be following up with folks. Feel free, if you've got additional questions, you can reach out. Our contact is tahoevacancytax@gmail.com. You can write to us there. You can read the full measure text at tahoevacancy.com/full text. It's also available on the homepage. For anybody excited about this policy, we'd love to have you get involved. You can donate, you can volunteer. We're just really excited to be sure that everyone has accurate information. So we'll keep answering questions. We'll keep putting information out there. We're excited to engage in dialogue. And thank you guys all so much for taking time out of your evening to be with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.